the night shift, Robert Sims returned home and found his wife unconscious on the kitchen floor. To his relief, their 2-year-old son Randy was asleep, undisturbed, in an upstairs bedroom. But their 6-week-old daughter Heather was missing. When she regained consciousness, Paula Sims was the only witness to a crime that baffles investigators to this day. Robert and Paula Sims had recently moved into this frame home in the St. Louis suburb of Alton, Illinois. Neighbors described the Sims as a quiet and private couple who spent most of their free time with their children.
They really seemed to be living the American dream. That was one of the things that was so intriguing about the story, to have this kind of violence, this kind of tragedy visited on such an all-American couple. That was what really turned the story for us at the beginning.
When police were called to the Sims home on April 19, 1989, they heard details of an unusual crime. Paula said she was taking out the trash just after 10 p.m. when a masked man armed with a gun forced her back inside the house and knocked her unconscious with a blow to the back of her head. That was the last thing she remembered before her husband found her on the floor 45 minutes later. Their infant daughter, Heather, was missing, but the area around the bassinet was undisturbed. Police could find no foreign fingerprints or footprints, and no valuables were missing.
We stayed there at the scene, it seemed like forever. I know we were there for a good half day. We looked everywhere. Every conceivable place where that child might have been, we looked.
Assuming the worst, police also searched the bottom of the Mississippi River near the Sims home.
We had asked Mr. and Mrs. Sims if they had any enemies that for whatever reason might want to steal their baby in order to punish them in some way, and they were pretty adamant that they didn't have anybody that they would suspect of doing that.
A neighbor reported seeing a suspicious character walking near the Sims home. Another informant saw an individual burying something that night behind a nearby factory. All of the leads were dead ends. Police had little to go on and no motive.
Seldom does anybody take a baby just to be taking it. There's usually a ransom demand, which we had none.
We found no evidence that there was any extramarital problem, any involvement of a boyfriend who might suspect he's the real father of the child and he wanted his child. We couldn't find anything that would explain why someone would target the Simses for a kidnapping.
4 days later, Charles Saunders was fishing on the Missouri side of the Mississippi River. Around noon, as Saunders was about to leave, he stopped to empty some trash into a barrel. Inside, he noticed a large black garbage bag. Because of its size, it looked suspicious. Inside, he discovered the well-preserved remains of a dead baby girl. Homicide investigators converged on the parking lot where the body of a baby girl was found in a garbage can.
Lying on her back, face up, her head tilted to one side. Still rather pink. Appeared that if you'd look at her, you'd think at first she was asleep. But she was in fact dead.
Hand and footprints from the dead baby were compared to the prints of Heather Sims, taken at the hospital just after she was born. The body was positively identified as Heather Lee Sims. Medical examiner Dr. Mary Case performed the autopsy. One of the first things she noticed, 3 small vertical cuts on the inside of the baby's lip.
Obviously, this is not, for example, a sudden infant death, which is a natural death. It's not a death by accident. It's not a death by suicide. So it's a homicidal death. And when I began the examination, there is no gunshot wound, there's no stab wound, there's no battering. And the inner lip showed changes that I associated with someone placing their hand over the nose and mouth and causing suffocation.
When death occurs, blood settles in parts of the body closest to the ground. This is called postmortem lividity and is usually dark red or purple in color. Heather's face showed signs of lividity, but it was cherry red in color. This told Dr. Case that the body had been placed in a freezer during the time lividity occurs, 8 to 12 hours after death. And there was another clue. The body had been frozen.
The external appearance was that there was no decomposition. When I looked internally, and then I even had to look microscopically at those internal organs to see this, but there was early decomposition beginning, but it was a little bit more advanced than externally.
Dr. Case concluded that Heather Sims had been suffocated, placed in a freezer face down, then placed in the trash bin, face up, either the night before or the morning that the body was discovered. Assistant State's Attorney Don Weber was keeping a close eye on this case. There was no evidence linking Paula or Robert Sims to the crime, but Weber decided to take a closer look at their story. Something Robert Sims told the FBI disturbed him.
He'd made the statement to the FBI that during the time that Heather was reported missing and the time she was found, that they had had the longest lasting and best sex that they'd ever had. And that is such a startling statement to me.
I couldn't, and I don't believe the other people involved in the case could really think that would be a normal response after your baby was kidnapped.
And when authorities looked into the couple's past, they found an alarming coincidence. At Heather Sims' funeral, Robert and Paula Sims looked every bit the grieving parents to the outside world. But a background check revealed the Sims had experienced another kidnapping. 3 years earlier, while living in another town, the Sims' first daughter, Lorelei, had also been kidnapped. It was the same scenario. Robert was at work, and Paula said a masked intruder confronted her in the house and kidnapped her baby. A few weeks later, the infant's skeletal remains were found scattered in a field behind the Sims' home. Although authorities had their suspicions at the time, they could find no evidence linking Robert or Paula Sims to Lorelei's murder.
The remains appeared to have been moved by some type of animal. The quality of the remains were of such that the investigation could not be put together as far as making a case of murder. The Simses themselves became even stronger suspects after that, and in my opinion is that they got away with murder.
But in the case of Heather's abduction, there was something about Paula's head injury that didn't sound right to prosecutor Don Weber. So Weber paid a visit to the medical examiner, Dr. Mary Case, who had a unique background. She was not only the pathologist who performed Heather Sims' autopsy, she was also a board-certified neuropathologist, an expert in the study of the brain and nervous system.
Paula says that she saw the guy outside, that the guy made her come inside, that he gave her instructions inside, that once she was inside, he hit her, and she gestured, Paula gestured, with the karate chop on the back of the neck, and that knocked her out, and she was out for about 45 minutes, and that she remembered getting hit. And I said, is that possible? And I remember Mary Case thought about it very carefully, and she sort of leaned back in her chair, and she said, now that's impossible.
When an individual is hit hard enough to cause unconsciousness, the soft brain tissue collides with the hard inner surface of the cranium, creating a brain injury. This disrupts the electrical activity in the outer areas of the brain where memories are stored. And it's this disruption which prevents memory from forming not only of the traumatic event, but for several minutes preceding the traumatic event. This explains why individuals knocked unconscious in an automobile accident, for example, remember very little about the accident or the events leading up to the accident. When police learned about this neurologic inconsistency, they looked for some connection between Paula Sims and the location where the body was discovered. Police found some three-dimensional shoe impressions in the dirt a few feet away from the trash bin. They appeared to be from an athletic shoe, but they did not match any of the shoes found in the Sims home. Next, police sent the black garbage bag which contained Heather's body to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. Forensic examiner David Attenberger had little to work with since there were no fingerprints, hairs, or fibers found on the bag.
The baby was found in a black garbage bag. The bag itself was made by Polytech Corporation out of Minneapolis. Kmart was the retailer of the bags, and they were sold under the brand name of Curbside.
However, more than 1 million of these curbside garbage bags were made for Kmart each and every day. Attenberger compared the edges of the bag containing Heather Sims' body to the first unused garbage bag from the Sims kitchen. But the stretching that occurs when bags are pulled from the roll made matching the ends impossible. But the bag Heather Sims was in did have a signature characteristic. Trash bags are made from large sheets of melted plastic. A blade makes the perforations so that the bags can be ripped from the end of the roll. At the same time, a heat seal melts the bottom of the bag shut.
The heat seal, as we found out from the manufacturer, as the plastic traveled beneath and through the heat seal, more debris collected on that heat seal. The more debris that collected on there, the more unique identifying characteristics that we found. We found incomplete melting of the heat seal.
This incomplete melting caused a small opening in the bottom of the Heather Sims bag. Debris on the heat seal also produced a small puncture hole in the bag. When Attenberger analyzed the bags found in the Sims kitchen, he found the same puncture hole in the same location. And he also found the same small opening in the bottom of the bags caused by debris on the heat seal. The last step was to analyze the dye lines in the garbage bags. As the plastic is pulled over the rollers in the manufacturing process, it gets stretched, leaving lines or stretch marks in the plastic called dye lines. When the dye lines on the inside of the Heather Sims bag were compared to the dye lines inside the first unused bag found in the Sims kitchen, the lines matched. The tiny puncture hole, the defect in the bottom heat seal, and the dye line comparison led the FBI to conclude that the first unused garbage bag in the Sims kitchen was made within 10 seconds of the bag Heather Sims' body was found in. Police now had their first piece of physical evidence linking an item in the Sims home to where Heather's body was found. They were no longer searching for a mysterious kidnapper, but a cold-blooded murderer. When the FBI discovered that the Heather Sims garbage bag came from the same roll of bags in the Sims kitchen, they were now convinced that Paula Sims was involved in her daughter's disappearance. Investigators learned that Paula and Robert Sims had an unusual marital relationship, a relationship Charles Bosworth described in his book, Precious Victims.
When Paula brought the little girls home from the hospital, she was essentially ousted from the marital bedroom. In the first case, she and Lorelei slept in the basement, which was where the family room was. It was a walkout basement.
Only after Lorelei's death did Paula sleep upstairs again with her husband. A year after Lorelei's death, Paula gave birth to a son, Randy. And in 1989, after moving to Alton, Illinois, the Sims had another baby, this time a daughter, Heather. In the hospital, Paula reportedly told her roommate that she didn't want another daughter, that she and Robert preferred boys.
The evidence clearly suggested that boys were fine, little girls were not welcome. We were told repeatedly by witnesses that Robert adored the little boy and was just completely uninterested in the little girls, even in the hospital after their births.
When Paula brought Heather home, separate sleeping arrangements started again. Paula and Heather in the living room, Robert and 2-year-old Randy upstairs.
And one of the comments that Paula made to one of her friends was that these sleeping arrangements are going to have to stop, or I'm going to have to do something about it.
Based on the garbage bag analysis and the inconsistencies with her head injury story, Paula Sims was arrested and charged with murder. On Saturday night, April 29, 1989, while Robert was working the night shift at the paper plant, prosecutors believe that Paula suffocated her daughter Heather. She placed the body in a garbage bag from the kitchen. She probably wore gloves, since no fingerprints were found on the bag. After the murder, Paula drove across town to her parents' home, where she placed Heather's body in her parents' freezer. Paula's parents were away that week on vacation. Paula returned home in enough time to feign unconsciousness before her husband returned from work. The next day, when Paula's parents heard about the kidnapping, they decided to end their vacation and return home immediately.
I don't want you to ruin your vacation.
This required a change to her plan. Paula now had to go back to her parents' home and remove Heather's body before they returned. With nowhere else to go, prosecutors believe she brought Heather's body back home, placing it in her own basement freezer. By this time, police had concluded their search of the Sims home and had left. 3 days later, Paula needed to get rid of the body once and for all. She made the 2-mile drive over the Mississippi River, across the Lewis and Clark Bridge, into a parking area, and left the frozen body in a trash bin, where it was discovered by a fisherman a short time later.
It was very premeditated, very well thought out, very cold-blooded, very systematic.
The prosecution had no trouble showing motive.
As you walk through the Sims home, it was very apparent that they had a boy that they were very proud of, which would be very normal for a couple. But as you look around the house, there was absolutely no indication whatsoever that they even had a daughter. There weren't any baby pictures. There weren't any pictures at all on the tables or around the walls or whatever to indicate that they had a baby at all.
Paula Sims was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
I think it's a tragic event anytime in society when a parent comes to the point that they are so frustrated for whatever reason that they decide to take the life of one of their children.
Well, anytime you've got the death of two, and I might add very beautiful, perfect little girls, it's a very sad case. When you add the element that their mother killed them, it gets even worse. On the other hand, justice prevailed.
No charges were filed against Robert Sims, who denies he had anything to do with these two crimes.
There's no doubt in my mind the right person is in prison right now for this particular crime. She did it. She murdered her child. She was tried by a jury of her peers, and she is now doing life. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that she did it.
And Robert Sims?
Not enough evidence right now. But I haven't forgotten Robert. And I still have the case file.
Two friends spent a summer afternoon skeet shooting in rural Pennsylvania. Only one returned home. A mystery that would take 20 years to solve. Montrose is a quiet rural area in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania. It's a small, close-knit community with stately homes, one traffic light, and a courthouse that dominates the town square. In 1976, Montrose was home to 30-year-old Martin Dillon, his wife Pat, and their two young children.
Marty Dillon was a very popular man in town, and his father was the local mayor. I mean, everybody knew him and really liked him.
An accident. The funeral took place in the same church where Martin Dillon was married. Dr. Scher was one of his pallbearers. For Martin Dillon's father, Larry, sadness was overshadowed by suspicion and doubt. He did not believe his only son's death was an accident. A few months after the shooting death of Martin Dillon, Dr. Stephen Scher divorced his wife, Anne. Some said it was the stress of the death of his best friend. Others said trouble had been brewing between Scher and his wife for some time. Either way, Stephen Scher moved from the small town of Montrose, Pennsylvania, and eventually settled in North Carolina. A year and a half later, the widow of his best friend, Martin Dillon. When Larry Dillon learned that his daughter-in-law and his two grandchildren were moving in with the only witness to his son's death, he grew increasingly suspicious. He questioned the conclusions of his son's autopsy, which was done by a family doctor who was not trained in forensic medicine. So Larry Dillon went to visit this man, Stu Bennett, a friend of his son's and a former police officer who was running a small company in Montrose specializing in accident reconstruction.
He felt that...
Read the report. The first thing he noticed was that Dillon's wound was 1 inch by 1.5 inches in size. But the internal diameter of a 16-gauge shotgun is 5/8 of an inch. A contact wound made by that gun would be the same size, 5/8 of an inch, and not any larger. To find out for sure, Stu Bennett conducted an experiment. He stretched some pig skin over a mannequin and used the same make and model 16-gauge shotgun with the same ammunition used in the accident. In order to create a wound the same size, the gun had to be 3 to 5 feet away from the pigskin.
Now, when I say the firearm is 3 to 5 feet away, I'm talking about the end of the barrel, all right, where the shell actually comes out. Now you have another 40 inches, 36 to 40 inches to the trigger housing itself. So now you're up to 6 feet away, between 5 and 6 feet away from the trigger housing to discharge the firearm, which means that he'd have to employ a stick or some other type of string or to have the gun discharge.
And there was no gunpowder residue on Dillon's shirt, which would have been present if it had been a contact wound. And there was no blood from the wound found on the shotgun barrel. Stu Bennett suspected homicide and shared his feelings with Larry Dillon.
It didn't surprise him. In fact, the family broke down and cried.
And the Dillons, like others in the small town of Montrose, began to hear rumors of Martin's death. Pat Dillon had been a nurse at Montrose General Hospital, the same hospital where Dr. Schur practiced.
There were rumors going on by employees in the hospital of open caressing, that sort of thing going on.
Maria Eptimiades described this clandestine relationship in her book, Secrets from the Grave.
They just didn't seem to care. They didn't care if anyone knew, if anyone saw them. When they were caught, they just sort of went back to their work, and, you know, it would just happen again.
Seasons passed, then years. And in time, law enforcement agencies moved on to other cases. But questions remained. What really happened at Gunsmoke that day in June of 1976? For almost 20 years, those questions remained unanswered. Martin Dillon's parents never gave up their fight to have their son's death re-investigated. They were convinced that the autopsy was incomplete and the manner of death incorrect. The state policeman who photographed the accident scene agreed with the Dillons and was never convinced it was an accident.
It's very frustrating when people don't want to listen and you know something's wrong. And see, back then, the state police, I mean, I love the state police. I was with them for 28 years. But they had, back then especially, a philosophy whereas if you have less time on the job than another man, you don't know anything. All right? Senior man always ruled.
In 1991, 14 years after the accident, Frank Zanen and others helped convince the state police to send the evidence to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. And they also sent the evidence to this man, Herbert McDonald, an expert in blood spatter. The first thing he analyzed were the boots Dr. Schur was wearing on the day of the accident, and he shot himself in the chest. But on Dr. Schur's boots, McDonald discovered a very fine mist of blood, which he identified as high-velocity impact spatter.
High-velocity impact spatter results when something, such as a bullet or shotgun pellets, strike a source of blood, like a body. As a result, the energy breaks up blood into very small spots. Their little droplets are almost atomized or vaporized.
Why would the cuffs right up?
Dr. Mihalakis also noticed what is called scalloping on the edges of the gunshot wound, evidence that the shot pellets had started to spread as they traveled through the air before striking the skin. Scalloping does not occur around a contact wound. Once the Dillons heard of this new information, they filed a petition to exhume their son's body for a second autopsy. This time, Dr. Mihalakis performed the autopsy. Dr. Mihalakis discovered that the direction of the wound track was in a downward direction at a 45-degree angle. The shot came from the right of Martin Dillon and went through Dillon's heart and left lung.
The wound track is wrong if the gun had dropped and then shot him. We would either have a perfectly backward or an upward wound track. Here, this was a sharply downward and very angulated from right to left.
Authorities could no longer ignore the evidence, and on June 26, 1995, Martin Dillon's death was formally declared a homicide. The next day, the challenge was accepted. Dr. Stephen Schur was arrested and charged with the murder of Martin Dillon. 2 decades after his death, Martin Dillon would finally get his day in court. 21 years after the shooting death of Martin Dillon, Stephen Schur sat in a courtroom
he had essentially been dumped. Pat Dillon said, no, I'm staying with my husband. I'm not leaving him. I'm not divorcing him.
Martin Dillon's children, whom Dr. Scher had raised since they were small, stood solidly behind their stepfather during the trial, even contributing a part of their father's life insurance proceeds for his defense. But the forensic evidence was too great. The jury convicted Dr. Stephen Scher of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
It's a case in which originally somebody took somebody's word and believed it and did not look any further, and there was no in-depth investigation done at that particular time.
The Dillons had some peace of mind. Is what really I wanted to see, was the Dillons relieved of the years, and I was happy for them.
The verdict was a long-fought victory for the parents of Martin Dillon.
Larry, what kind of thoughts went through your mind when that first-degree verdict came back? Were you thinking of Marty?
Yes.
What kind of thoughts are going through your mind?
Well, I really did it for him.
Did you ever think this day would come?
I've been praying for it.
After Dr. Scher spent 20 months in prison, the Pennsylvania Superior Court overturned his conviction. A judge said the state's 20-year pre-arrest delay caused substantial prejudice to his right to a fair trial. In 2002, that decision was overturned. Dr. Scher was retried in March of 2008. A jury deliberated just 2 hours before finding him guilty yet again. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
It begins with sound that never makes it into police reports, a sound too human to archive, too fragile to log as evidence. The quiet click of a kitchen clock at 2:14 a.m., counting seconds of the Tennessee house that should have been asleep, counting down to the moment a life slipped out of reach and into the dark. The night of August 1996 was thick with heat, cicadas screaming in the trees, the air unmoving, heavy, the kind of night that presses against your skin and refuses to let go. Somewhere in the stillness, a door opened, or maybe it never fully closed, and a story began that would not end for decades. The house sat on a road most people drove without noticing, a stretch of asphalt bordered by pines and mailboxes leaning at odd angles, each one a quiet witness. Inside lived routine, ordinary objects arranged in ordinary ways. Shoes by the door, a coffee mug in the sink, a calendar still turned to August. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing warned what was about to fracture. And yet by morning, this place would become a crime scene, and the word cold case would one day cling to it like frost. The victim was known here, known in the way small communities know their own, recognized by first name, by car, by habits. Someone who waved at neighbors, who followed patterns so predictable they felt safe. That predictability would soon become part of the mystery, because when dawn arrived and the absence was discovered, it was the absence that screamed. A bed untouched, a car still parked, a silence that didn't belong. Police lights cut to the morning haze, red and blue flashing against the trees, washing the quiet road in urgency. Deputies moved carefully, their boots crunching gravel, their radios crackling with half-finished sentences. Inside the house, they found what criminals always leave behind without realizing it. Disturbance without explanation. A chair out of place. A drawer half open. No forced entry. No obvious struggle. The kind of scene that refuses to tell you what happened and dares you to guess wrong. Neighbors gather at the edge of yellow tape, arms crossed, faces tight with concern and curiosity. Whispers move faster than facts. Someone mentioned a strange car scene late the night before. Someone else remembered hearing a noise, maybe a shout, maybe just the wind. Stories collided, overlapped, contradicted each other. By noon, rumors had already begun to harden into beliefs, and beliefs into accusations. Investigators worked the scene with the tools of the time. Fingerprint dust, flashlights, notepads thick with scribbled observations. They collected fibers, photographed footprints, sealed items into evidence bags that would later sit untouched for years. And among those items barely noticed, almost routine, was a trace so small it seemed insignificant. A smear, a fleck, DNA, still an emerging weapon in the mid-90s, powerful but slow, promising but limited. It was logged, labeled, stored away, waiting for a future that didn't exist yet. The first interviews began before the sun reached its highest point. Friends, family, co-workers, anyone who might have crossed paths with the victim in the final hours. Questions repeated until voices grew hoarse. Where were you last night? When did you last see them? Did anything seem off? Answers came easily at first, then hesitated, then tangled themselves in nervous pauses. Grief does strange things to memory. Fear does worse. There was a boyfriend, and next, a neighbor who kept to himself. There always is. Each name became a possibility. Each possibility a temporary obsession. Detectives chased leads that led nowhere, knocked on doors that opened to confusion, or slammed shut in anger. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The headlines shifted from shock to speculation. Mysterious disappearance shakes community. No arrests in local cold case. The word cold arrived early, whispered before it was officially declared. By winter, the case had begun to lose heat. Tips slowed. Evidence dried up. Investigators stared at bulletin boards layered with photos and timelines, lines of string connecting theories that no longer made sense. The absence of answers became its own presence, sitting heavy in the room, daring someone to confront it. Families kept waiting for the phone to ring. It didn't. Years passed. Technology surged forward without looking back. The 90s faded into the rearview mirror, and with them, the urgency of a case that refused to move. The evidence boxes were transferred, reorganized, archived. The DNA samples slept in darkness, coded, cataloged, forgotten. Officers retired. New detectives inherited old questions with no context, no momentum, no promise of resolution. And yet the case never truly died. It lingered in local memory, resurfacing at anniversaries, in newspaper retrospectives, in the quiet moments when someone drove past that house and felt a chill without knowing why. It lived in the way the community locked doors a little tighter, trusted a little less. An unsolved crime doesn't just haunt families. It reshapes towns. Somewhere in a state lab, years later, machines grew faster, smarter, more precise. Databases expanded. Algorithms learned how to listen to what DNA had been trying to say all along. And one day, a technician pulled an old file, a routine task, just another sample among thousands. Tennessee, 1996. Unsolved. Cold. The screen flickered. Numbers aligned. A signal appeared where there had only been noise before. The past, long silent, cleared its throat. And in that moment, without warning, a case that had been buried under time and resignation took its first breath in decades, unaware that the truth it carried was about to unsettle everything everyone thought they knew. The signal didn't announce itself with sirens or celebration. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does, as a line of code that refused to disappear when the technician refreshed the screen. At first it looked like a glitch, a false alignment, the kind of thing labs learned to distrust. Old samples were notorious for contamination, degradation, wishful thinking. But this one held steady. The markers lined up too cleanly, too deliberately. Something from 1996 was speaking the language of the present. Back then, DNA had been hope wrapped in uncertainty. Investigators collected it because they were told to, not because they trusted it to deliver answers. They sealed it in envelopes, wrote case numbers in black ink, and moved on to leads they could touch, question, pressure. In Tennessee, that approach had led them down familiar roads. Jealousy, money, proximity. None of it stuck. The DNA was insurance for a future no one expected to see. Now the future had arrived, and it was impatient. The lab flagged the result and sent it up the chain. A supervisor leaned over a screen, squinting, then leaning closer. The match wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was close enough to demand attention. Partial profiles could still point a direction. Enough to reopen a door that had been locked for 20 years. Cold case detectives are trained not to react. They've learned that excitement is dangerous, that hope can sabotage judgment. But even the most seasoned investigator feels something when a dead case stirs. It's like hearing a voice echo in an empty room. Someone was there. Someone left something behind. Someone thought time would erase it. The case file was pulled from storage, its edges frayed, its pages yellowed. Photos from the crime scene spilled across a conference table. Grainy images of a house frozen. In the exact moment confusion took over. The misplaced chair, the open drawer, the calendar still turned to August. Investigators traced timelines with their fingers, reread statements, rediscovered contradictions that had been ignored or misunderstood. What stood out now wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. No forced entry. No neighbors reporting a violent struggle. No signs of a break-in. Whoever came into that house had either been invited or knew exactly how to enter without drawing attention. That detail had been noted before, then buried under louder theories. Now it clawed its way back to relevance. The DNA had been recovered from a place that felt intimate, almost invasive. Not blood spattered in rage. Not skin under fingernails from a desperate fight. It was quieter than that, collected from an object handled, touched, left behind without urgency. The kind of trace someone forgets because they don't think of themselves as dangerous, because they don't think of themselves as suspects. Detectives began rebuilding the final day, minute by minute, stripping away assumptions layered on by years of speculation. They asked different questions now, not who had motive in 1996, but who had access, who moved through that house without raising alarms, who belonged there just enough to be invisible. Old names resurfaced, so easy to dismiss. Others lingered longer than expected. A friend who stopped by unannounced. A co-worker who knew the routine. A neighbor whose presence had never felt strange because it had always been there. Familiarity, investigators realized, had been the perfect camouflage. They tracked down witnesses who had grown older, voices slower, memories dulled by time. Interviews took on a different tone. In 1996, everyone had been afraid of saying the wrong thing. Now fear had shifted. People were afraid of remembering, afraid of what hindsight might reveal about their own blindness. One witness paused for a long time before answering a question they had been asked decades earlier. Back then, they had shrugged it off, a detail too small to matter. Now it sounded different. A car parked where it didn't usually park. A light on at an odd hour. A visit that hadn't made sense, but hadn't felt threatening either. The investigators listened without interrupting. They knew better now. Silence was where the truth hid. As the lab worked to refine the DNA profile, detectives quietly began cross-referencing names with modern databases. People move. People change jobs, change addresses, change lives. But DNA doesn't adapt. It waits. And sometimes it waits patiently for the world to catch up. The partial match led them not to a person, but to a family tree. Genetic genealogy, a tool that didn't exist when the crime was committed, was now opening doors no warrant ever could. Distant relatives appeared on screens, connected by invisible threads of shared markers. The past was assembling itself piece by piece, indifferent to the consequences. With each connection, the circle tightened. Not around a stranger, not around a drifter passing through town, but around someone rooted in the same soil as a victim. Someone who had attended the same local events, driven the same roads, smiled at the same cashiers. Someone the town had never questioned, because questioning them would have meant questioning the illusion of safety. The realization hit the room like a drop in temperature. This wasn't a story about an outsider. It never had been. As the profile sharpened, the name at the center of the web became harder to ignore. It had appeared in the file before, mentioned briefly, dismissed quickly. No criminal record. Cooperative. Helpful. The kind of person investigators are taught to move past in order to chase louder suspects. Now, with science filling in the gaps memory had left behind, that name returned with weight, with gravity, with a question that could no longer be avoided. What if the answer had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for technology to expose what human judgment had missed? The name didn't come with drama. No red flags. No violent past. It sat there on the page like it always had. Ordinary, almost boring, the kind of name you skim past without stopping. That ordinariness had protected it for decades. In 1996, investigators had seen it, nodded, and moved on. Too clean, too normal, not worth the risk of tunnel vision. Now the same name fell heavier, as if the letters themselves had gained mass. Detectives didn't announce their interest. They never do. Curiosity is quieter than accusation. They started by mapping the life that name represented, not just in 1996, but across the years that followed. Addresses, employment records, marriages, divorces, small, mundane details that add up to a portrait. The picture that formed wasn't of a man on the fringes. It was of someone embedded, someone who blended so well into the background that no one ever thought to pull them forward. In 1996, this person had lived close, not next door, but close enough to know patterns, close enough to know when the house was usually quiet, when routines shifted, when doors were left unlocked out of habit rather than trust. Proximity had always been a factor in the investigation, but had been treated like a wide net, not a scalpel. Now it was becoming precise. The detectives returned to the house in their minds, reconstructing it from photographs and notes. The layout, the lines of sight, the places where sound carried, and where it died. They noticed how easy it would have been for someone familiar with the space to move through it without hesitation. No searching, no hesitation, no panic, just steps taken with confidence. They revisited the object that had yielded the DNA. In the 90s, it had been logged, bagged, forgotten, a neutral artifact. Now, it was the loudest witness in the room. It suggested contact, not chaos. Presence, not struggle. The kind of presence that feels safe right up until it isn't. Investigators asked themselves a question they hadn't dared to ask before. What if the victim hadn't realized they were in danger? What if the moment of violence came after conversation, after familiarity, after the ordinary rhythm of a day interrupted not by fear, but by surprise? The theory shifted. Not a sudden attack by a stranger. Not a crime driven by impulse alone. Something slower. Something that had been forming quietly, unnoticed, perhaps even unacknowledged by the person carrying it out. Resentment doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for an opening. As the genetic genealogy work continued, the family tree narrowed. Branches that had seemed promising dead-ended. Others converged. The technician spoke in careful language, probabilities and percentages, but the detectives heard what lay beneath it. The odds were collapsing. The margin for coincidence was shrinking. They pulled the old interview transcript. The voice on the page was calm, polite, cooperative. The answers were measured, never defensive, never overly detailed. At the time, it had read like innocence. Now it read like control, not a performance. Exactly, more like restraint. The absence of emotion where emotion might have been expected. One line stood out. A response to a routine question about the day of the crime. A small discrepancy in timing. Insignificant on its own. In 1996, it had been dismissed as faulty memory. Now it felt deliberate, a subtle adjustment, a way to slide past a window of time without drawing attention to it. Detectives began to test the timeline again, this time with modern tools. Cell phone records were limited in the 90s, but landline logs still existed. So did employment schedules, handwritten time cards, old receipts preserved in boxes no one thought to throw away. The past leaves traces even when it doesn't mean to. The more they aligned the data, the more the window narrowed. There it was. A gap, not large, not dramatic, just enough. Enough time to be somewhere else. Enough time to do something irreversible. They didn't rush to confront. Confrontation too early can poison a case. Instead, they kept digging, quietly building a structure strong enough to stand on its own. They spoke to people who had known the suspect then and now. Friends described them as reliable. Co-workers called them steady. No one remembered anger. No one remembered violence. That, too, became part of the profile. Some crimes aren't committed by people who lose control. Some are committed by people who maintain it. A former acquaintance hesitated before sharing a memory. It wasn't dramatic, just a moment. A comment made years after crime, offhand, almost joking. Something about how the town never really figured out what happened. Something about how people saw what they wanted to see. At the time, It had sounded like cynicism. Now it sounded like distance, like someone watching a story from the outside, confident it wouldn't turn back toward them. The investigators felt the shift then, the point where suspicion becomes gravity. Everything started to pull inward. The case stopped being abstract and started being personal. The lab called again. The DNA profile had been refined further. The probability was no longer theoretical. It was overwhelming. This wasn't just a direction. It was a destination. Detectives prepared for the interview like surgeons. They reviewed strategy, tone, pacing. This wasn't about aggression. It was about pressure applied slowly, carefully, letting silence do the work. People who have lived with secrets for decades often underestimate how heavy those secrets have become. When they finally sat across from the suspect, time seemed to fold in on itself. The room was modern, but the questions reached back 20 years. The suspect listened, nodding, the same calm demeanor preserved intact. If they felt fear, it didn't show. If they felt recognition, they hid it well. The detectives didn't start with accusations. They started with memories. The town, the house, the routines. They watched closely for reactions, for shifts too small to notice without practice. A pause here, a breath there. The body knows things the mind tries to bury. When the DNA was mentioned, just as a concept at first, something flickered. Not panic, not shock, calculation. The suspect asked how reliable such evidence was, how old samples could really be trusted. The question came too easily, too prepared, as if it had been rehearsed long before this moment. That was when the room changed. The detectives laid out the science, piece by piece, not dramatically, not triumphantly. Just facts, just inevitability. They spoke about technology advancing, about how time doesn't protect what it once did. They spoke about how the past waits. The suspect leaned back, arms crossing, eyes narrowing just slightly. Still calm, still controlled. But the distance between 1996 and now was collapsing, and for the first time, it showed. Outside that room, the town went on with its day, unaware that a story it thought it knew was being rewritten, unaware that the quiet assumptions it had carried for decades were about to fracture. The case that had haunted it like a ghost was no longer a mystery drifting in the fog. It was standing in a chair, breathing, answering questions, realizing that the silence it had relied on was finally running out. The room held its breath, the kind of stillness that feels heavier than sound, where every movement seems amplified even when no one moves at all. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, indifferent to the weight of history pressing down on the table. The suspect sat there, posture controlled, expression measured, as if this were just another appointment, another obligation to be checked off and forgotten. But time has a way of bending in places like this, and the years began to compress, folding back on themselves until 1996 felt close enough to touch. The detectives didn't push yet. They let the silence stretch. Silence makes people talk. Silence invites the mind to fill the void, and the mind is rarely kind when left alone with its own memories. They asked about the town again, about how it felt back then, smaller, quieter, before the headlines, before the fear crept into everyday conversations. The suspect smiled faintly, nostalgia flickering across their face like an old photograph briefly held up to the light. They spoke about knowing everyone, about how nothing ever really stayed secret for long. It was said casually, almost fondly, but the detectives caught the contradiction immediately. Nothing stays secret, unless someone makes sure it doesn't. The conversation drifted toward routine, work schedules, familiar drives, ordinary days that blur together until one of them doesn't. The suspect answered smoothly, timelines rolling off the tongue with practiced ease. It was impressive, really, how intact the story remained after all these years. No cracks, no confusion, almost too perfect. That perfection was its own kind of flaw. The detectives gently shifted course, bringing up details that hadn't been widely reported at the time. Small things, the position of an object, the way a door had been found. Information only someone close to the scene would have absorbed naturally. The suspect listened carefully, nodding, absorbing every word. And then, just once, they corrected something. A minor detail, an instinctive response. It was the kind of slip that happens when familiarity outruns caution. The room tightened. The detectives didn't react. They didn't acknowledge it. They simply continued, letting the suspect realize on their own that something had gone wrong. A moment later, the suspect backtracked, laughing it off, claiming confusion. But the damage was done. The past had peeked through the present, just long enough to be seen. They returned to the DNA, this time without soft edges. They explained how the sample had been preserved, how technology had caught up with what investigators once lacked. They talked about databases, about distant relatives unknowingly opening doors that had been sealed for decades. Each sentence was delivered evenly, without accusation, without judgment. Facts don't need emotion. They carry their own weight. The suspect's jaw tightened. Hands clasped together more firmly now, knuckles whitening slightly. Control was still there, but it required effort, the kind of effort that leaves traces. The detectives asked a simple question, not about guilt, not about motive, just about memory. They asked what the suspect remembered feeling during that time, when the town was searching, when rumors spread, when fear settled in. The answer came slower this time. Words chosen carefully, arranged like furniture in a room meant to impress rather than comfort. They spoke about sadness, about shock, about how terrible it all was. But there was something missing. No sense of loss. No personal impact. It was grief described from a distance, as if observed rather than experienced. That absence echoed louder than any confession could have. The interview paused. Water was offered, declined. The detective stepped out briefly, leaving the suspect alone with the hum of the lights and the echo of their own thoughts. Outside, the hallway felt colder. The past was pressing harder now, pushing against the present with undeniable force. They reviewed notes quickly, the slip, the reactions, the narrowing timeline. Everything was aligning, not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily, like a door closing inch by inch. When they returned to the room, the air had changed. The suspect sensed it. People always do. This time, the detective spoke about opportunity, about proximity, about how crimes like this rarely come from nowhere. They talked about familiarity turning into entitlement, about boundaries quietly eroding long before they're crossed. They didn't name the suspect. They didn't have to. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The suspect shifted in the chair, uncrossing and recrossing their arms, a small restless movement betraying the effort to remain composed. They asked what this was really about. The question came sharper than before. The detectives answered honestly. It was about truth, about time no longer being an ally, about a case that refused to stay buried. They said nothing about arrest, nothing about charges, just that the evidence was strong and growing stronger. For the first time, something like fear surfaced, brief, controlled, quickly buried beneath a practice calm. But it was there, a crack in the armor. Outside the station, the town remained unaware. People drove familiar roads, passed familiar houses, lived alongside a story they thought was finished. The weight of the revelation hadn't reached them yet, but it was moving quietly, inevitably, like a storm still below the horizon. Back in the room, the detectives leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to signal that this wasn't a conversation that could be escaped with politeness anymore. They asked one final question, not about the crime itself, but about living with the past, about carrying something heavy for a very long time and pretending it isn't there. The suspect didn't answer right away. Silence returned, thicker now, charged with everything unsaid. The hum of the lights seemed louder, almost intrusive. The suspect stared at the table, eyes unfocused, as if watching another room entirely, another time, another version of themselves. When they finally spoke, the voice was quieter, still controlled, but strained like a structure under pressure. They said the past has a way of distorting itself, that memories change, that people convince themselves of things they need to believe in order to survive. The detectives listened, saying nothing. They didn't need to interrupt. The truth was circling now, tightening its grip, and whether it would be spoken aloud or dragged into the light by evidence alone was no longer question. The question was how much longer the silence could hold. The silence didn't break all at once. It thinned slowly, like fog lifting just enough to reveal shapes beneath it. The suspect inhaled. A controlled breath meant to steady the body, but the body remembered before the mind could stop it. Shoulders sagged a fraction. Eyes blinked too often. Time, that old accomplice, was beginning to betray them. The detectives shifted again, not forward, not back, just enough to reset the balance of the room. This was no longer an interview balanced on politeness. This was gravity taking hold. They spoke about the night itself now, carefully, deliberately, reconstructing it not as a sequence of accusations, but as a landscape. The weather, the quiet, the way sound travels differently after midnight in a small Tennessee town, how footsteps feel louder, how engines echo longer, how witnesses remember fragments rather than facts. They described the route, the familiar back roads, the shortcuts locals use without thinking, roads that don't show up clearly on old maps, roads that only someone who belonged there would choose. The suspect nodded unconsciously at one point, a reflexive acknowledgement, before realizing what they were agreeing with. Another tiny fracture. Another thread pulled loose. The detectives mentioned the item found years later, the one that hadn't made sense at first, the one cataloged and forgotten when nothing matched it. They talked about how it had been stored, untouched, waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. They didn't dramatize it. They didn't need to. The implication alone was enough. Evidence doesn't age the way people do. It waits. The suspect asked how long this was going to take. The question came out sharper than intended, irritation flashing briefly across the face. The detectives answered calmly, as long as it needs to. Time, after all, was no longer the suspect's ally. They spoke about pressure next, about how lives fracture quietly before they break, about stress that builds invisibly, about resentment that festers behind polite smiles and routine hellos, about how violence rarely announces itself with chaos, but slips into existence through opportunity and justification. They watched the suspect closely, not for denial, but for recognition. Recognition came as a tightening around the eyes, a brief hardening of the mouth, a defensive reaction, automatic, learned. The suspect responded with a story they had told many times before, about being somewhere else, about a night that was ordinary, forgettable. The detectives let it play out, every detail delivered smoothly, confidently, like a well-rehearsed script. When it ended, one detective asked a single question. Not where, not when, who? The suspect hesitated, just a second too long. Long enough for memory to flicker before discipline snapped it back into place. They answered anyway, naming someone from that era, someone distant enough to be safe, someone who couldn't contradict them anymore. The detectives nodded, writing it down, though the name had already been crossed off the list years ago. They brought up the witness then, not directly, just the idea of memory resurfacing unexpectedly. How people convince themselves they didn't see what they saw, didn't hear what they heard, until something shakes the foundation hard enough to let the truth slip through. The suspect's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped. The detectives explained how this witness hadn't come forward for decades, how fear had sealed their mouth, how guilt had eventually pried it open. They didn't say what the witness claimed to have seen. They didn't have to. The suspect's eyes darkened, calculating, running scenarios at a speed that betrayed familiarity with the risk. Outside, clouds gathered low over the town, the sky flattening into a dull gray that pressed against rooftops and trees. It was a kind of day locals would later remember without knowing why, a day that felt heavy even before the news arrived. Inside the room, the detectives leaned into the past, describing the investigation as it had stalled, the mistakes made, the leads that went nowhere. They spoke openly about failures, about missed chances, about how easy it is for a case to go cold when there's no obvious monster to chase. The suspect listened, expression unreadable now, the earlier confidence replaced by guarded neutrality. Then came the pivot. The detectives described reopening the evidence, piece by piece, with fresh eyes. They talked about the DNA again, but this time they framed it differently, not as proof, but as a voice from 1996, preserved in silence, finally loud enough to be heard. They said the match wasn't just close. It was precise, statistical certainty wrapped in cold numbers. They explained how chance had been ruled out, how coincidence had been eliminated. They didn't say the suspect's name in that context. They watched to see if the suspect would say it for them. The suspect swallowed. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, they asked for a break. The detectives agreed. Control, when granted sparingly, can feel like mercy. The suspect stood, stretching stiff limbs, pacing the small room like a caged thought. Alone now, no audience, no questions, just a hum of lights and the echo of everything closing in through the one-way glass. The detectives watched without comment. They'd seen this moment before in other cases, that fragile space where the mind weighs denial against inevitability, where the cost of silence finally begins to outweigh the cost of truth. When the suspect sat back down, something had shifted. The posture was different, less rigid, less performative. The mask wasn't gone, but it was cracked. The detectives returned, resuming their seats with deliberate calm, as if nothing had changed at all. They didn't press immediately. They let the suspect speak first. The voice that came out was lower now, slower. The suspect talked about the town again, but this time without nostalgia. They spoke about pressure, about feeling watched, about the weight of expectations in a place where everyone knows your name. They spoke about mistakes, not the crime, but the idea of mistakes, the abstract concept of a life veering off course. The detectives listened, attentive but unmoved. They had heard this prelude before. They knew what often followed. The suspect stopped mid-sentence, breath catching briefly. For a moment, it seemed as though the truth might spill out right there, raw and unfiltered. Instead, the suspect straightened, regaining composure, retreating once more behind controlled language and careful phrasing. But the room remembered the hesitation. The past had pushed closer than ever before, close enough to be felt on the skin. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, darkening the pavement, blurring reflections in shallow puddles. The town moved on, unaware that a story it thought was finished was being rewritten in real time, sentence by sentence, silence by silence. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives prepared to apply pressure again, not with force, not with anger, but with patience, because patience had finally caught up with the truth, and the truth was no longer willing to wait. The rain outside settled into a steady rhythm, soft but relentless, tapping against windows like a countdown no one could stop. Inside, the air felt denser, as if every word spoken so far had stayed behind, stacking itself invisibly between the walls. The detectives didn't rush. They understood that momentum, once gained, didn't need to be forced. It needed space. They began again, not with questions, but with facts delivered flatly, almost casually, the way a weather report lists temperatures, dates, times, locations, each one precise, each one verified. The suspect listened, eyes fixed on a spot just above the table, jaw clenched hard enough to pulse. This was no longer a story being told to them. It was a mirror being held up. The detective spoke about patterns now, about how crimes don't exist in isolation, how behavior leaves signatures even when people believe they've erased their tracks. They referenced phone records that didn't exist back then, but existed now through triangulation and billing archives. Old technology resurrected by new analysis, movements reconstructed from fragments, gaps filled not with guesses, but with probabilities so tight it left no room to breathe. The suspect interrupted once, insisting on a detail, correcting a minor point about timing. The correction was accurate, too accurate. Another unconscious reveal. Another door left ajar. The detectives acknowledged it without reaction, simply adjusted their notes, letting the suspect feel, just for a second, the quiet terror of knowing they were being understood too well. Understanding, in this room, was not sympathy. It was precision. They returned to the witness, this time closer, clearer. They described how memory can be triggered by sound, by smell, by a face glimpsed on television decades later. How a single image can collapse years of denial. They spoke of the witness's hands shaking as they finally told their story, of the pauses, the tears, the relief that came of confession, not of guilt, but of silence. The suspect asked what exactly the witness had said. The detectives declined to answer directly. Instead, they asked the suspect what they thought the witness might have seen. Silence again. Thicker now. Charged. The suspect shifted, leaning back, crossing arms, a defensive posture meant to reclaim control. But the eyes gave it away. The calculation was back. The fear, sharper this time, edged with something else. Regret, maybe, or anger that the past refused to stay buried. They talked about the victim then, not as evidence, not as a case file, but as a presence, who they were, where they were headed that night. The small choices that placed them at the wrong intersection of time and intention. They described the search, the volunteers, the flyers stapled to telephone poles, the way hope lingered long after logic said it shouldn't. The suspect's breathing changed. Subtle but real, faster, shallower. The detectives described the discovery, not graphically, just enough to remind the room that the outcome had been final, irreversible, that someone had lost everything while someone else had gone on living, aging, building a life layered over a secret like fresh paint over rot. They asked the suspect how it felt, carrying that weight all these years. The suspect laughed once, a short, sharp sound, defensive, brittle, said they didn't know what the detectives were talking about, said they'd answered everything already, said this was harassment. The detectives didn't argue. They nodded, acknowledging the response, then gently dismantled it by laying out the final pieces. The DNA wasn't just from one source. It was corroborated. Secondary transfer ruled out. Environmental contamination eliminated. Science, unlike memory, did not forget. It preserved. It remembered perfectly. They slid a folder across the table. Inside were charts, graphs, explanations simplified enough to be undeniable. The suspect didn't touch it, didn't need to. The truth had already crossed the distance. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the suspect asked a question so quiet it barely carried across the table. What happens now? The detectives answered honestly. Arrest was possible. Charges were imminent. But there was still room for explanation, for accountability, for the kind of truth that doesn't change the past but reshapes its aftermath. The suspect stared down at their hands. Hands that had aged. Hands that trembled now despite years of control. When they spoke again, the voice was stripped of performance, bare and uneven. They said they never meant for it to go that far. The room seemed to contract around the sentence. The detectives didn't react outwardly, but something settled inside them. A threshold crossed. Not a full confession. Not yet, but a crack wide enough for light. The suspect talked about panic, about fear spiraling out of control, about a moment that stretched too long and ended too fast. The words came carefully, still guarded, still incomplete, but no longer entirely false. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming harder now, washing the town in gray. Somewhere beyond the station walls, people moved through their routines unaware that history was shifting quietly, decisively, under fluorescent lights. The detectives listened without interruption. This wasn't about interruption anymore. This was about letting the truth exhaust itself, about allowing the weight of decades to finally press down without resistance. When the suspect fell silent again, the room held the echo of what had been said and what hadn't. The case, once frozen in time, was breathing now, unsteady, fragile, alive, and everyone in that room understood the same thing at once. There was no going back. The room didn't relax after that admission. It tightened. A confession, even a partial one, doesn't release tension. It concentrates it. The detectives exchanged a look that carried years of shared instinct, a silent agreement that the next minutes mattered more than the last 30 years combined. Every word now would either pull the truth closer or send it retreating back into shadow. They let the silence stretch again, not as a tactic, but as an inevitability. Silence was doing the work for them. It forced memory to surface. It forced the suspect to sit with the sound of their own voice echoing in their head, repeating the sentence they could never take back. They asked for clarification, gently, almost conversationally. What did that far mean? Where exactly had the moment shifted from fear to action, from accident to choice? The questions were calm, controlled, stripped of accusation, not because the detectives doubted what they were hearing, but because they knew anger would shut the door they just cracked open. The suspect swallowed hard. The throat moved visibly. The eyes flicked toward the door once, instinctively, then back to the table. There would be no exit that way. There never was. They talked about the night again, but this time the details weren't abstract. They were sensory. The smell of damp asphalt, the sound of tires on gravel, a radio playing something forgettable, something that stuck anyway, because memory clings to the meaningless when it's trying to survive the unbearable. The suspect described hands, shaking on the steering wheel, a heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought. The detectives listened, occasionally anchoring the story with a question. Where were you standing? Which direction were you facing? How close were you when it happened? These weren't interruptions. They were guide rails, keeping the narrative from slipping into vagueness, from dissolving into excuses. The suspect hesitated at key moments, as if approaching invisible barriers. Some memories resisted being spoken aloud, not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear. When the suspect faltered, the detectives didn't rush in. They waited. They knew that waiting was often louder than pressing. Eventually, the suspect described the confrontation. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just sudden. Words exchanged that weren't meant to last, but did. A misunderstanding, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, something that had been simmering unnoticed. The line between motive and impulse blurred, as it so often does in crimes that change lives forever. The detectives asked about the aftermath, about the moments immediately after. People often focus on the act itself, but investigators know the truth hides in what comes next. Panic reveals more than intent. Decisions made in seconds speak louder than those planned over months. The suspect's voice dropped. They talked about standing there, realizing what couldn't be undone, about the sound of their own breathing, ragged and unfamiliar, about looking around, searching for witnesses, for cameras, for anything that might confirm or deny reality. The world, they said, felt unreal, like it had tilted slightly off its axis. The detectives noted how the suspect avoided certain words, how they circled around specifics, substituting phrases like, "What happened?" instead of naming the act. It was a common defense, even now, language as insulation. They gently pressed again, asked what was done next. The suspect rubbed their face with both hands, dragging them downward slowly, as if trying to wipe something away that had been there for decades. When they spoke, the words came heavier now, less controlled. They talked about moving the body, about choices made not to escape justice, at least not consciously, but to escape consequences in the moment. The distinction mattered to them, even if it didn't to the law. The detectives didn't correct that. They simply let the record reflect what was being said. As the story unfolded, the cold case transformed. Dates and evidence that had once floated disconnected now snapped into place. The timeline aligned. The unexplained gap made sense. The odd witness statement dismissed years ago suddenly carried weight. What had once been a puzzle scattered across decades was becoming a single, continuous line. The suspect stopped again, visibly exhausted. Confession is not catharsis. It's labor. It demands energy, memory, confrontation with self long buried under routine and denial. The detectives offered water. A small gesture, human, grounding. The suspect accepted it with shaking hands. They asked if anyone else had known. The question landed harder than expected. The suspect stiffened, said no, then paused, said maybe, then corrected themselves, said they had never told anyone directly, but that some people might have suspected. Silence as a way of leaking, of shaping behavior, of leaving traces in relationships even when words are never spoken. The detectives asked names. The suspect resisted at first, then offered one, a friend from back then, someone who had asked too many questions, someone who had drifted away shortly after. Another loose end, potentially, but one that could now be followed. Time passed strangely in that room. Minutes felt elastic. Outside, the rain had slowed, leaving the city washed clean, streets reflecting streetlights like broken mirrors. Inside, the past was being dismantled piece by piece. The detectives summarized what they had heard, not as a conclusion, but as confirmation. They repeated the suspect's own words back to them, carefully, accurately. This wasn't for intimidation. It was for clarity. to ensure there was no misunderstanding, no room later for denial or reinterpretation. The suspect nodded along, eyes downcast. When the detectives finished, they asked a final question, one that always hovered at the edge of cases like this. Why now? The suspect didn't answer immediately. When they did, the voice was barely above a whisper. They talked about age, about sleep becoming harder, about faces appearing uninvited in dreams, about seeing the victim's family in news articles, anniversaries, interviews, still waiting, still hurting, still frozen in a moment the suspect had walked away from. They said the DNA result felt like a reckoning, like the past reaching forward and tapping them on the shoulder. Not violently, not angrily, just insistently. A reminder that time doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. The detectives closed the folder, stood up slowly. Procedure would follow. Lawyers would enter the picture. Statements would be formalized. But something irreversible had already happened, something no legal maneuver could undo. As the suspect was let out of the room, the chair left behind still warm, the detectives stayed where they were for a moment. They didn't celebrate. There was no triumph here, just a heavy, quiet acknowledgement that a story unfinished for decades had finally found its voice. The cold case was no longer cold, but the echoes of it would never fully fade. The hallway swallowed the sound of footsteps as the door closed behind them, but inside the building the case kept breathing, alive now in a way it hadn't been for 3 decades. Paper moved. Phones rang. The machinery of justice, dormant but never dismantled, began to turn again, slow at first, then with gathering certainty. What had lived for years as a question mark was becoming a statement, and statements demand consequences. Evidence lockers were reopened. Boxes sealed with yellowing tape were pulled from shelves like artifacts from another era. Inside them, the past waited patiently. Photographs curled at the edges, reports typed on machines that no longer existed, envelopes marked with dates that felt impossibly distant. Detectives leaned over tables, rereading everything through a new lens, every sentence now illuminated by what had just been spoken in that interview room. The DNA report sat at the center of it all, no longer an abstract scientific miracle, but a hinge on which everything turned. Lab technicians had done their work quietly, methodically, unaware at first of the magnitude of what they were unlocking. A degraded sample, once considered useless, had been coaxed back into relevance by technology that didn't exist when the victim was last seen alive. A profile reconstructed molecule by molecule, matched against databases that had grown like living organisms over the years. Science, patient and indifferent, had remembered what people could not. Investigators compared the confession to the physical evidence, the placement, the timing, the route taken afterward. Each detail aligned with unnerving precision. This wasn't a story shaped to fit the facts. It was a story the facts had been waiting for. But certainty doesn't quiet the noise. It amplifies it. News began to travel, first internally, then outward, leaking into the world like electricity, finding exposed wire. Reporters caught whispers. Old headlines resurfaced, dusted off and reposted, now with tentative updates attached. A community that had learned to live with not knowing felt something shift under its feet. For some, it was relief. For others, disbelief. For a few, anger sharp enough to taste. The victim's name appeared again on screens and in print, spoken aloud after years of silence. Not as a mystery this time, but as a person pulled back into the present by the gravity of truth. Family members were notified carefully, professionally, with words chosen to minimize harm, but unable to prevent it. No sentence exists that can soften the impact of learning how and why someone you loved never came home. They listened. They asked questions. Some cried. Some didn't. Shock has many forms. The past, once frozen, began to move again, and movement hurts. Investigators prepared the formal charges, aware that time had complicated everything. Memories fade. Witnesses age or disappear. Evidence degrades. But confession, corroborated by DNA, carries a weight that decades cannot lighten. The law recognizes that some truths arrive late, but still arrive whole. As the suspect sat in custody, alone now with the silence they had finally broken, the psychological toll became visible. The bravado that sometimes accompanies denial was gone. In its place was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone. Years spent compartmentalizing, constructing a life around an absence, had taken their toll. Routine had been built over a fault line, and now the ground had given way. They asked for a lawyer. The process continued. Detectives returned to the crime scene, not because they needed to, but because they felt compelled to. The location looked different now. Buildings replaced empty lots. Trees had grown tall where there had once been scrub and shadow. But standing there, knowing what they now knew, the air felt charged. Not haunted, exactly, but marked. Some places remember, even when people try not to. They imagine the night as it had been described. The darkness, the tension, the irreversible moment. Understanding doesn't require sympathy, but it does demand acknowledgement. This had not been an abstract crime. It had been a collision of lives, choices, fear, and consequence, frozen in time until now. Old witnesses were contacted again. Some were surprised to hear from police after all these years. Others had expected it, had lived with the sense that the story wasn't finished. A few remembered details they had once dismissed as insignificant. A car scene at the wrong time. A person behaving strangely afterward. Small things, now heavy with meaning. One former acquaintance, named during confession, confirmed suspicions they'd carried quietly for decades. They hadn't known, not for sure, but they had felt something off. The way conversations ended abruptly, the way certain topics were avoided, the sudden distance that followed the crime. Silence, it turned out, had been shared, even if unspoken. The case file grew thicker, no longer bloated with unanswered questions, but reinforced with answers that carried weight. Prosecutors reviewed everything with a careful eye, aware that the defense would scrutinize every gap, every assumption. Cold cases don't get second chances. They get one shot at resolution, and it has to count. Public reaction intensified as confirmation became official. Headlines shifted from speculation to declaration. The word, solved, appeared bold and definitive, carrying with it a strange duality, celebration and grief, closure and reopening, an ending that was also a beginning. For the family, the days blurred together. Interviews were requested, statements drafted, decisions made about how public their private pain would become. They spoke of remembrance, of loss, of years lived in the shadow of uncertainty. They spoke of anger, too, and a relief so complicated it felt wrong to name it as such. Investigators watched from a distance. They had done their job, but the job never truly ends. Cases like this don't close cleanly. They linger, imprinting themselves on everyone they touch. Even resolution leaves residue. Late one evening, after the building had mostly emptied, a detective sat alone with a file. 30 years of pages, now culminating in a single outcome. They thought about the younger version of themselves who had first encountered the case. Full of urgency and limited tools. They thought about how many times they'd wondered, quietly, if it would ever be solved. The answer sat in front of them now, undeniable. Time had not defeated the truth. It had only tested it. And as the lights dimmed and the city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, one thing became clear in the quiet. Some stories refused to stay buried, and when they finally surfaced, they changed everything they touched forever. The courtroom air felt heavier than it should have, dense with expectation, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Decades of silence had led to this moment, and silence, once broken, does not return gently. It shatters. Every bench was filled. Faces young and old sat side by side, generations connected by a crime that had lingered longer than some lives. This was no longer history. This was present tense. The defendant was brought in without ceremony. No dramatic entrance. No visible resistance. Just a soft scrape of chair, the muted clink of restraints, the sound of a life narrowing. Cameras clicked. Pens moved. Eyes fixed forward. The person who had existed for years as a shadow in police theories now had a body, a name, a pulse the room could feel. The prosecutor spoke first, voice controlled, deliberate, each word placed like a brick. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The timeline spoke for itself now, stretched across decades but anchored by fact that refused to bend. They described the night, the victim's last known movements, the sudden disappearance, the fear that spread faster than answers. They spoke of evidence once thought too damaged to matter, now resurrected by science, transformed into a voice louder than any witness. DNA, 3 letters that landed like a verdict before one had even been reached. The defense listened, unreadable. Their strategy would be careful, methodical, aimed not at denying the science, but at questioning the story built around it. Time, they would argue, corrupts memory. Confessions can be shaped by pressure. Technology, though powerful, is not infallible. They would ask the jury to consider doubt, to look for cracks where certainty claimed dominance. But doubt was struggling to breathe. When the confession was introduced, the room shifted, not because it was theatrical, but because it was specific, painfully so. Details only someone present could know. Movements, objects, decisions made in seconds that echoed for 30 years. The voice recording played, flat and unembellished, carrying none of the drama people expected and all the horror they didn't. This was not a performance. It was a release. Some jurors looked away. Others leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of truth finally spoken aloud. Outside the courtroom, the community waited. News vans lined the street. Social media pulsed with updates. Opinions forming faster than facts could travel. For many, this case had been a cautionary tale, a reminder whispered to children and newcomers alike. Don't walk alone. Lock your doors. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Now, that lesson had a face, and it unsettled people more than the mystery ever had. Former investigators watched coverage from their homes. Some retired, some gray-haired and quiet. They remembered knocking on doors that led nowhere, following leads that evaporated, explaining to families why there were no answers yet. For them, this moment carried vindication and regret in equal measure. Vindication that persistence mattered. Regret that justice had taken so long. The victim's family sat together, hands clasped, a unit forged by loss. They had imagined this day in fragments, never quite believing it would arrive. There was no celebration in their posture, no triumph, just a steady endurance, the kind built over years of waking up to absence. The truth, when it came, did not heal. It clarified. As testimony continued, experts took the stand. Lab technicians explained processes that sounded almost unreal to anyone not steeped in science. Microscopic traces, algorithms, statistical certainty. They spoke calmly, aware that their words carried the power to erase doubt. This was not speculation. This was math. This was biology. This was the body remembering what the mind tried to forget. The defense cross-examined, probing for contamination, for procedural missteps, for anything that might weaken the chain. But the chain held. Each link had been forged carefully, reviewed repeatedly, tested against scrutiny sharpened by years of cold case skepticism. This investigation had known it would be questioned. It had prepared accordingly. Days passed. The rhythm of the trial settled into something almost routine, but the tension never left. Every recess buzzed with murmurs. Every resumed session tightened the air again. People slept poorly. Even those not directly involved felt it, the way unresolved stories pull at collective nerves. When closing arguments arrived, there was no need for theatrics. The prosecutor spoke of accountability, not vengeance, of a victim whose voice had been taken, now restored through evidence and persistence. They reminded the jury that time does not erase responsibility, that justice delayed is still justice demanded. The defense appealed to caution, to the danger of certainty, to the irreversible nature of a guilty verdict. Their words were measured, respectful, but they could not undo what had already been seen and heard. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. The waiting began again. Hours stretched, then more hours. Night fell. The courtroom emptied except for the necessary few. Somewhere behind closed doors, 12 people weighed decades of silence against the clarity of truth. They spoke quietly, seriously, aware that their decision would close a chapter written long before most of them knew it existed. When they returned, the room filled once more. Everyone stood. The foreperson's hands trembled slightly as they passed the paper forward. The clerk read the verdict aloud. Guilty. The word echoed not loudly, but completely. There was no outburst, no dramatic collapse. just a collective exhale. Sharp and involuntary, the defendant lowered their head. The family closed their eyes. Justice, when it finally arrives, is often quiet. It doesn't shout. It settles. As sentencing was scheduled and the courtroom slowly emptied, the story began its final transformation. No longer a cold case. No longer a mystery. It became something else entirely. A reminder that the past is never truly past, that evidence waits, that witnesses remember, that silence has a shelf life. And long after the headlines fade, after the cameras move on, after the courtroom lights dim for the last time, the echo of this case will remain, embedded in the community like a scar, proof that even buried truths can surface, and when they do, they leave nothing unchanged. The sentence did not fall immediately. The judge set a date, and with that simple act, time stretched once more, taut and uneasy. Outside, the crowd thinned, but the tension stayed behind, clinging to the courthouse like humidity before a storm. For some, the verdict felt like an ending. For others, it was only the beginning of something far more complicated. Closure is a word people reach for when they don't know what else to say. Inside this case, closure had sharp edges. In the days that followed, the confession was dissected line by line. Media analysts replayed it, slowed it down, debated tone and pauses as if truth could be altered by volume. Former friends of the defendant came forward, stunned, insisting they had never seen this coming. Others stayed silent, realizing that silence had been the case's most faithful companion from start. Every interview added texture, but no comfort. Answers rarely do. Investigators returned to old notes, not because they needed them, but because habits forged over decades are hard to break. Files once marked inactive were now stamped resolved, a word that felt almost foreign. They spoke quietly among themselves about moments they wished they'd seen differently, about doors they hadn't knocked on hard enough, about technology that hadn't existed when it mattered most. Progress, it turned out, had been both the villain and the hero of the story. The victim's name resurfaced everywhere. News segments, opinion columns, online threads where strangers argued over facts they'd only just learned. To the family, this sudden attention was overwhelming, intrusive, and strangely hollow. They had carried that name every day without applause, without an audience. Now it belonged to everyone, and that felt like another loss layered on top of first. As sentencing approached, the defense shifted its tone. No longer focused on doubt, it leaned into mitigation. Age, time passed, a life lived quietly since the crime. They spoke of remorse, of cooperation, of the weight the defendant claimed to have carried in silence. But remorse measured in decades arrives too late to undo anything. It can only sit beside the damage, never replace it. Letters poured into the court. Some demanded the harshest possible punishment. Others asked for mercy, citing redemption, religion, the idea that people are more than their worst acts. The judge read them all. Justice, after all, must listen before it speaks. But justice does not confuse empathy with erasure. On the morning of sentencing, the courtroom felt different, less charged, more solemn. This was not about proving anything anymore. This was about reckoning. The defendant stood again, older now in the eyes of the public than they had been weeks earlier, as if the truth had accelerated time. When given the chance to speak, their words were brief, apologies offered, responsibility acknowledged. No explanations. None would have sufficed. The sentence was handed down with careful precision, each year named aloud, stacking one atop another, a numerical representation of harm. There was no gasp, no reaction that cameras could sensationalize, just a nod, a quiet acceptance, and the sound of the gavel marking a point of no return. Afterward, the courtroom emptied for the last time. Chairs scraped. Conversations murmured. Lives resumed, altered but moving forward because they had no choice. Outside, the sky was clear, indifferent to human resolutions. The world, as always, kept turning. Yet in the small town that had lived with this case for so long, nothing felt quite the same. People locked doors a little differently now, not out of fear, but awareness. They spoke the victim's name with respect instead of uncertainty. They told the story not as a warning unfinished, but as a truth confronted, however late. And somewhere in the quiet spaces left behind by the noise, the case lingered, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder that justice is patient, that truth does not decay, and that even after decades of darkness, a single strand of evidence can pull the past into the light, forever changing everyone it touches. Long after the sentence was spoken and recorded, long after the microphones were packed away and the courthouse doors locked for the night, the case continued to breathe in quieter places. It breathed in the living rooms where families sat staring at televisions that had already moved on to the next headline. It breathed in the minds of detectives who woke before dawn, replaying scenes that no longer belonged to the present. It breathed in the town itself, in sidewalks and intersections that had once been backdrops to an unspeakable act, now forced to absorb the weight of truth. There's a moment after every major reckoning when the noise drops out completely. No arguments, no speculation, just an uncomfortable stillness. For this case, that stillness was louder than anything that had come before. People expected relief. What they found instead was exhaustion. Decades of wondering had burned something deep into the community, and answers, when they finally arrived, did not erase that scar. They simply traced its outline. The investigators returned to their routines, but nothing felt routine anymore. Coffee tasted different. Paperwork felt heavier. The younger officers listened with new attentiveness when the veteran spoke, sensing that this was more than a solved file. It was a warning. Evidence overlooked is not evidence gone. Silence does not mean absence. Time does not forgive mistakes. It only waits for them to be exposed. Across town, the victim's family faced a reckoning of their own. Justice had spoken, but grief does not obey court schedules. There were no instructions for how to live after the truth finally settles. Some felt anger resurface, sharper now because it had a clear target. Others felt an unexpected emptiness, as if the mystery had been a terrible companion. But companion nonetheless. When it vanished, it took a piece of their daily structure with it. They sorted through old belongings again, not searching for clues this time, but for memory, photographs curled at the edges, handwritten notes, ordinary objects that had survived while a life had not. Each item carried a double meaning now. Proof of who was lost, and proof that they had existed beyond headlines and court transcripts. The world might remember a case. They remembered a person. In the weeks that followed, experts weighed in. Criminologists talked about patterns. Legal scholars debated precedent. Technology specialists explained, again and again, how a fragment of DNA could outlast lies, fear, and time itself. But beneath the analysis was an unspoken truth. This case could have remained buried forever. It had not been inevitability that brought it back. It had been persistence. Someone, somewhere, refused to let it stay quiet. The defendant was transferred, processed, absorbed into a system built to contain consequences. There were no dramatic scenes, no final confessions whispered in hallways, just the dull machinery of accountability, doing what it does best, moving forward without sentiment. A number replaced a name. A routine replaced freedom. The past, however, did not release its grip so easily. Back in the town, conversations shifted. Parents spoke differently to their children. Old rumors were revisited, stripped of their exaggeration, examined under the harsh light of confirmed facts. Some people felt vindicated. Others felt exposed. A few realized with a cold clarity how close they had been to the truth without ever seeing it. Anniversaries came and went, but now they carried a different tone. Not just remembrance, but reflection. Candlelight vigils no longer asked for answers. They acknowledged them. The silence during those gatherings was no longer filled with questions, but with shared understanding that the past, once hidden, now demanded to be carried honestly. And still, the case refused to fade completely. It surfaced in training manuals, in conference panels, in quiet conversations between detectives at the end of long shifts. It became a reference point, a lesson etched into professional memory. Never assume the story is finished just because the trail grows cold. Cold cases are not dead. They are waiting. In the end, what lingered most was not the shock of the revelation or the drama of the courtroom, but the uneasy knowledge that truth can exist alongside lies for an uncomfortably long time. That justice can arrive late and still matter. That one overlooked detail can change everything. decades after the moment it was left behind. The case was closed on paper, but in the collective consciousness of everyone it touched, it remained open in a different way, not as a mystery, but as an echo reminding them that the past is never truly gone, only silent, listening, and patient enough to wait until someone finally dares to listen back. The night air felt heavier after that, as if the town itself had absorbed the verdict and did not yet know how to release it. Streetlights hummed over empty roads, casting long shadows where patrol cars once idle for hours, engines running. Officers staring at nothing, waiting for something to break. Now it had broken, and the pieces lay everywhere, invisible but sharp. People walked more slowly, spoke more carefully, as though a single careless word might reopen wounds that had barely begun to scab. Inside the police department, the evidence room was quieter than usual. Boxes that had not been touched in decades sat back on their shelves, tagged, logged, finally understood. The DNA sample, once an overlooked fragment, now carried a strange gravity. It had been silent for years, patient, immune to fading memories and shifting alibis. It had waited to retirements, funerals, budget cuts, and political promises. It had waited until the world caught up to it. Veteran investigators stood in that room longer than necessary, hands on hips, eyes fixed on cardboard and steel. They weren't looking at the evidence anymore. They were looking backward. At every moment they had walked past it, every assumption that had felt reasonable at the time, regret didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in, quiet and relentless, asking questions no one could answer now. What if we had pushed harder? What if we had tested sooner? What if the technology had existed back then? What if someone had listened? Outside the station, reporters moved on. News cycles always do. A solved cold case becomes yesterday's miracle, replaced by fresher tragedies, newer shocks. But for those who lived inside the story, time did not reset so easily. The past had been dragged into the present, and it refused to leave without leaving marks. The family felt it most in the mornings. That was when the weight returned, before distractions could soften it. Justice had arrived, yes, but it had not brought back laughter at the breakfast table or footsteps in the hallway, or voices calling from another room. Closure was a word used by people who had never waited this long. What they felt instead was clarity. Painful, sharp, undeniable clarity. They visited the grave again, not with the same questions, but with a different kind of conversation. Words spoken out loud, meant for someone who could no longer answer, yet somehow still listened. They talked about the arrest, about the trial, about how the truth had finally surfaced after hiding in plain sight. They talked about the years that had been stolen, not just from the victim, but from everyone who loved them. In town, the old theories dissolved. The whispered names, the sideways glances, the quiet accusations that had poisoned relationships for years. Some were proven wrong, others simply irrelevant now. There was relief in that, but also shame. Innocent people had carried suspicion like a shadow, all because the real answer had been locked away in a lab that didn't yet exist. The case became a ghost story of a different kind, not about what might have happened, but about what did and how easily it could have stayed hidden forever. Parents warned their children not with fear, but with awareness. Teachers referenced the case not to shock, but to explain how truth can be delayed and why persistence matters. Late at night, one of the lead investigators sat alone in his car, parked outside his house, engine off, dashboard dark. He replayed the timeline again, not because it would change anything, but because letting go felt impossible. Solving the case had not erased the faces he remembered from the early days. The family members begging for answers, the exhausted officers knocking on doors that led nowhere, the town holding its breath year after year. He understood now that some cases don't end when they're solved. They change shape. They become lessons, warnings, quiet reminders that every unanswered question carries a cost, and that cost compounds over time. The DNA had spoken, but it had also accused, not just a person identified, but a system that had once lacked the tools to hear it. Progress had rewritten the ending, but it could not rewrite the delay. And in that space between then and now, lives had unfolded under a cloud of uncertainty that no verdict could fully lift. As months passed, the shock dulled, but the awareness remained. Somewhere, in another evidence room, another overlooked fragment waited, Another case sat dormant, labeled cold, assumed finished, and this story, etched into memory and record alike, whispered a warning into the future. Silence is not the same as absence, and time, no matter how much passes, does not bury the truth. It only tests how long the world is willing to ignore it. Dawn crept in slowly, pale and uncertain, touching the edges of the town like a question that still didn't have a clean answer. The headlines were quieter now. The shock had passed. What remained was something heavier, more complex, a truth that refused to sit neatly inside a headline or a court transcript. People woke up knowing that a mystery which had once defined their sense of safety had finally been named, but naming it had not made it harmless. The convicted man sat in a cell built of concrete and routine, a place designed to strip time of meaning. For him, the years collapsed inward, past and present pressed together, until excuses lost their shape. He had lived freely while suspicion scattered elsewhere, while lives around him bent under the weight of not knowing. Now the science had spoken with a voice too precise to argue with. No dramatic confession, no cinematic breakdown, just numbers, sequences, certainty. The most damning witness was invisible, carried in blood and cells, immune to lies. In the courtroom, echoes lingered long after the benches emptied. The gavel strike still seemed to vibrate in the wood, a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had taken decades to finish. Those who attended remembered the silence more than the words. Silence when the verdict was read. Silence when the defendant was led away. Silence when the family stood, hands shaking, unsure what came next because the question that defined their lives had finally been answered. Back in the neighborhoods that once felt watched, people revisited memories with new eyes. That night in 1996 didn't change, but the meaning of every detail did. A parked car no one questioned. A noise dismissed as nothing. A face seen once and forgotten. The human mind had tried to make sense of chaos with the tools it had, and those tools had failed. The realization settled uncomfortably. The truth had brushed past countless lives without stopping. Investigators from other jurisdictions took notice. Files were reopened. Old evidence boxes were pulled from storage, dust shaken loose like years falling away. This case had become a signal flare. If it could be wrong for this long here, it could be wrong anywhere. The cold was no longer a synonym for dead. It meant waiting. It meant unfinished. The victim's name appeared again, not just as a statistic or a case number, but as a person. Articles dug deeper into who they had been before becoming evidence. Friends spoke about laughter, habits, plans that never reached their conclusion. The crime had frozen them in one moment, but memory began to move again, refusing to let that moment be the only one that mattered. At night, the town felt different. Not safer, not dangerous, just altered, like a room where furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Familiar shapes were still there, but nothing was exactly where people remembered it. Trust had to be relearned, not because the threat was unknown anymore, but because it had been hiding so close for so long. The case files were officially closed, stamped, archived. Yet in conversations, it stayed open. In classrooms, in diners, in quiet moments before sleep, parents wondered what else they had misunderstood over the years. Officers wondered which instincts they should have followed harder. Ordinary people wondered how many truths were still waiting for the right moment to surface. This was the aftermath no one prepared for. Not the arrest, not the verdict, but the long echo that followed, stretching into places no investigation could reach. Justice had arrived late, carrying both relief and accusation, and it left behind a landscape forever changed by what it revealed. Somewhere, technology continued to advance, indifferent to human timing. Databases grew, algorithms sharpened. The future promised fewer unanswered questions, but no guarantees. Because behind every cold case was a human story, and science, for all its precision, could only speak when someone chose to listen. And in Tennessee, the ground held its secrets a little less tightly now. One truth had been pulled free, and in doing so, it reminded everyone of an uncomfortable reality. The past is never finished. It waits, it watches, and when it finally speaks, it does so with a clarity that leaves no room to hide. The days that followed did not move forward in a straight line. They circled, they folded back on themselves. Every conversation seemed to drift inevitably, to the same place. People spoke in lower voices, as if the past could still hear them. The solved case had not closed the door. It had opened a corridor long and dim, lined with questions no verdict could erase. For the family, time fractured. There was life before the truth and life after it, and no bridge that cleanly connected the two. Relief came in short, guilty bursts, followed immediately by grief sharpened instead of softened by certainty. They had imagined this moment for years, rehearsed it in private thoughts, believing that answers would bring peace. Instead, the answer arrived like a blunt instrument. It did not soothe, it clarified, and clarity hurt. They replayed the investigation in their minds with cruel precision, the early interviews, the promises made by authorities who were sincere but overwhelmed, the evidence collected, mislabeled, shelved. Every delay now felt personal, even if it wasn't. The knowledge that the truth had existed all along, dormant and silent, gnawed at them. Justice delayed had not been neutral. It had shaped decades. Across town, retired detectives watched the news with complex expressions. Some felt vindication. Others felt exposed. Policing in the 90s had been built on instinct, pressure, limited tools, and relentless public demand for quick answers. DNA had been a whisper back then, not the thunderclap it would become. Still, hindsight was merciless. Every missed opportunity now stood under a harsh, modern light. Young officers listened closely. This case became required reading, a cautionary tale passed down in briefing rooms and training academies. Preserve everything. Trust the evidence even when it contradicts your gut. Assume the future will know more than you do. The lesson was expensive, paid for in years, and lives altered beyond repair. Media crews eventually packed up and left. The trucks rolled away. The microphones disappeared, but the story stayed, embedded in the identity of the place. Tennessee had carried this silence for 30 years. Letting it go was not simple. Silence had become familiar. Noise, even truthful noise, was disruptive. The man convicted became a shadow again, reduced to a mugshot and a DOC number. Some wanted him forgotten immediately. Others needed to understand him, to trace the path that led to that night, searching for warning signs that might prevent the next tragedy. Evil, when named, still demanded explanation. Late at night, when traffic thinned and the town exhaled, the places connected to the case felt different. Ordinary roads, ordinary buildings, yet memory clung to them, thick and stubborn. Nothing had changed physically, and yet everything had. The past had been dragged into the present, and now both had coexist. Cold cases were once described as frozen in time. This one proved that was never true. They were alive, breathing quietly, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for persistence to outlast forgetting. And as the shock slowly dulled into something quieter, something more reflective, one realization settled in with uncomfortable clarity. Solving the case did not end the story. It transformed it. The mystery was gone, but the impact remained, stretching forward, shaping how this community would remember, how it would trust, how it would listen when the past finally decided to speak again. The final truth did not arrive with sirens or applause. It came softly, almost politely, settling into the cracks left behind by 30 years of not knowing. By the time the courtroom emptied and the cameras cut away, what remained was not triumph but weight, a sense that something irreversible had been completed, and something else, just as permanent, had been taken away. People expected closure, to feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like a reckoning that refused to stop echoing. The victim's name was spoken more often now than it had been in decades, but each mention carried a different tone. Not speculation, not rumor, fact. And facts, once confirmed, have a gravity all their own. They pull memories into alignment. They rearrange the emotional furniture of a life. For the family, mornings were the hardest. Waking up meant remembering again that the question mark was gone, replaced by a period that felt too heavy for the sentence it ended. They no longer wondered who did it. They wondered why it took so long. They wondered who they might have been if the truth had come earlier. Those questions had no evidence to test, no lab to analyze them. They lived on unchallenged. The community learned to speak about the case in the past tense, But the past tense did not make it distant. It made it precise. Teachers referenced it carefully. Parents used it as a warning, without naming it directly. Conversations paused when someone realized they were standing too close to a place where something irreversible had happened once, long ago, and yet not long ago at all. Investigators closed the file, but not the memory. Some kept copies of the reports at home, not out of duty, but out of need. Proof that persistence mattered. Proof that time could be an accomplice or an adversary, depending on how it was treated. Proof that silence was never empty. It was just waiting. DNA had spoken, finally, after decades of being ignored, misunderstood, underestimated. A microscopic witness that never forgot. It did not care about theories or reputations or expired leads. It carried the truth patiently until someone was ready to listen. And that may have been the most unsettling part of all. The realization that answers had always existed, embedded in the smallest fragments, while lives moved forward without them. That justice had not been absent, only delayed. That the past is never done with us. Not really. It waits. It watches. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, it reaches forward, clears its throat, and tells the story exactly as it happened. The case was solved. The mystery was over. But the echo remained, drifting through Tennessee's quiet nights, a reminder that even when the truth finally emerges, it does not erase what came before. It only ensures that what happened will never disappear again.